In the spring of the war in Ukraine, a new front is emerging, not on the battlefield, but in the realm of the atmosphere. Ukraine is making an unprecedented climate reparations demand on Russia, claiming that the war has produced extra greenhouse gas emissions on a massive scale and that Russia should be held financially accountable. He said, "We have huge amounts of additional CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases." Pavlo Kartashov, Deputy Minister for Economy, Environment and Agriculture, Ukraine. That statement cuts to the heart of what Ukraine now calls a separate dimension of its long war with Russia, environmental damage, not only to land, forests and water, but to the atmosphere itself. Between February 2022 and today, Ukraine's calculations indicate roughly 237 million tonnes of extra CO2 equivalent have been released as a result of the war. That is comparable to the annual emissions of Ireland, Belgium and Austria combined. The additional emissions are traced to multiple sources: fossil fuels consumed by military vehicles and aircraft, large-scale destruction of buildings and infrastructure requiring cement and steel in reconstruction, widespread deforestation and fires from military operations and shelling. Regarding the valuation, Ukraine's expert advisors used a social cost of carbon estimate of roughly $185 per tonne to build their damage figure. When multiplied by the 11-digit tonne figure, the required compensation claim rises into the tens of billions. According to Ukrainian officials, they will now seek about 43 to 44 billion US dollars in reparations from Russia for these emissions-related damages. This is the first time a country has formally proposed holding another state financially responsible for war-driven greenhouse gas emissions, in effect treating the climate impact of war as a damage category on its own. The legal and practical foundations are untested. Ukraine is hoping to set a precedent. Ukraine argues that the war has done more than immediate destruction. It has altered the climate equation for its territory and beyond by accelerating emissions, destroying carbon-sequestering forests, and forcing ongoing reconstruction under war conditions. By placing an emissions number and dollar figure on those damages, Ukraine is framing part of its war case as an environmental justice claim. Ukraine will submit the claim through a mechanism being established at the Council of Europe. Already, about 70,000 individual claims for damage caused by Russian aggression, not just emissions, have been submitted via Ukraine's Register of Damage to the Council of Europe. What remains to be determined is how widespread the process will be, which kinds of damages qualify, and crucially, where the money will come from. Frozen Russian assets are one obvious candidate for compensating Ukraine, though the legal path is complex. Meanwhile, Ukraine is mobilizing data, experts and calculations to ensure the claim holds up in an emerging international framework. From Kyiv's standpoint, this is more than bookkeeping. It is a moral and strategic move. It emphasizes that the war's impacts are not merely territorial, physical or economic. They are ecological and global. Ukraine points to forests ravaged by war, land scarred by heavy bombardment, rivers and wetlands damaged or destroyed, and now it points to the atmosphere. He said, "A lot of damage was caused to water, to land, to forests." Pavlo Kartashov, Deputy Minister for Economy, Environment and Agriculture, Ukraine. That damage is the basis of the emission claim, and the claim is the basis of Ukraine's request for accountability. Ukraine is effectively saying the cost of the war is more than tanks, bullets, bombs. It includes climate change. Russia has so far declined to engage in discussions of climate reparations related to the war. From the outset of the conflict, Moscow has declared it will not pay war reparations in the traditional sense for the invasion's destruction. The idea that it would pay for extra greenhouse gas emissions is far more novel. International observers are watching closely. If Ukraine succeeds in anchoring this claim in a formal mechanism and securing compensation, or at least a binding decision, it could open a pathway for future conflict carbon claims globally. Wars produce emissions. Who pays for them? That is the new question. Some analysts warn of heavy practical difficulties, verifying the emissions, attributing them to particular actions, isolating war-connected emissions from baseline economy, deciding on the legal basis for payment, and mobilizing frozen assets for climate damage compensation rather than reconstruction. Beyond the headline figures, the war has wrought widespread environmental harm in Ukraine. Large areas of forest and land have been destroyed or deforested due to fires, shelling, and military activity. Some estimates show tens of millions of tons of CO2 released just from fires aggravated by war, the destruction of infrastructure, damage to energy systems, forced population displacements and refugee flows also carry carbon footprint consequences. The war is not only a security crisis, it has become a climate crisis for Ukraine and for the wider region. For Ukraine, the claim has several strategic aims. It bolsters Kyiv's wartime diplomacy by framing the dispute not only in military and territorial terms, but in environmental and moral terms. It places Russia and the international community under new pressure. The war's cost is expanding beyond tanks and civilians. It may help draw attention and resources to Ukraine's long-term reconstruction and ecological recovery, both of which will be costly and enduring. For Russia, if the claim succeeds, it could mean a new category of liability, one that goes beyond conventional war reparations and enters the domain of climate responsibility. That has implications not only for Russia, Ukraine, but for any future war-affected states asserting climate damage claims. For the international community, the affair raises novel legal, financial, and ethical issues. Can war-driven emissions be quantified reliably? Can states be held to account for them? Will frozen assets be redirected from reconstruction support to climate damage liability? How will this reshape global norms around war, climate, and compensation? There are substantial obstacles to Ukraine's ambitious claim, quantification and attribution, calculating exactly how many tons of additional emissions are caused by war, isolating them from baseline economic activity, and attributing them to Russian military action is inherently complex. Legal basis: while international law recognizes state liability for environmental damage in some contexts, applying it to wartime emissions is untested. Enforcement and payments: even if a successful claim is recognized, enforcing payment from Russia is difficult. Frozen assets may offer a pool, but their use is politically charged and legally complex. Precedent risk: if Ukraine succeeds, other states may issue similar claims, raising concerns about openness and financial exposure in future conflicts. Some governments and analysts worry about creating a flood of liability. Reconstruction versus compensation. There is a debate whether funds should go into rebuilding Ukraine, infrastructure, housing, industry, or paying for climate damage. Kyiv is seeking to link reconstruction, environmental recovery, and compensation into a unified agenda. The next key phase will be the formal submission of the claim by Ukraine through the Council of Europe-affiliated mechanism. Then the establishment of a commission or tribunal to evaluate the claim will be crucial. Ukraine's experts and advisors are already engaged in documenting and quantifying damage. The international climate and legal community is watching how case law may evolve. The use of frozen Russian assets remains a live question. If mechanisms are found to redirect those assets toward climate-related compensation, it could mark a shift in how the world finances post-war recovery and accountability. Ukraine is also emphasizing the link between its ecological recovery and its broader national recovery strategy, cleaning up land, rebuilding infrastructure, reforesting and reducing future vulnerability. By tying that into the compensation narrative, Kyiv is making climate resilience part of its national war effort. In a moment when war and climate are too often treated as separate crises, Ukraine is insisting the two are connected, that war creates emissions, destroys carbon sinks and burdens the atmosphere, and that those burdens must be accounted for. He said, "The day will come when Russia will pay for all its crimes." Ruslan Strilets, then Ukraine's environment minister. By adding climate damage to the ledger of war, Ukraine is broadening the idea of what justice means after aggression. If successful, this case may reshape how the world thinks about conflict, emissions, and accountability. The war in Ukraine may yet rewrite not only the map of East Europe, but also the ledger of the planet.